The Super Nintendo was supposed to have backwards compatibility with the NES in some form, whether a cartridge adapter or actually being included via the console itself, but Nintendo didn't want people to evolve that quickly. Many were a bit miffed that they couldn't play their old games on the SNES, but that didn't stop them from really digging shit. I think this was a true testament to the power of backwards compatibility. The Sega Genesis had it via an adapter, the Super Nintendo sold more. The Atari 1700 had it built in, nobody cared. It's a great feature, but it obviously doesn't affect sales all too much. Though if you really wanted to play older games through your SNES, you had options. The Super Game Boy allowed you to play Game Boy games on the system. Not sure if this really counts as backwards compatibility since the Game Boy is handheld, more so an outlet for the Super Nintendo to express itself. This is awesome. It's great to be able to play these games via a method that doesn't fucking stink. But of course, it only plays Game Boy games. What about Game Boy Color games? Well, the same year the Game Boy Color released, in Japan only, Nintendo released an updated Super Game Boy, the Super Game Boy 2. It could play Game Boy games and now had the ability to hook up a link cable to play multiplayer Game Boy games. Finally! And if you really wanted to play NES games on your SNES, there was an unlicensed adapter released, the Super 8 in 1995. Not a bad accessory considering it could play Japanese Super Famicom and Famicom games in addition to NES and SNES. Not fully ideal, I mean, it's unlicensed. The games don't run as good as they would be playing through the standard SNES slot or on a regular NES, but back in the day, this made things a bit more convenient. But this was when backwards compatibility came to a crashing halt. The mere fact game consoles moved over to CDs instead of cartridges meant there really weren't any feasible ways to incorporate support for the previous generation of consoles. Like, were you really going to include a cartridge slot on your fancy CD machine? Sega, you son of a bitch. Well, on the Sega Saturn, this is really only for stuff like memory cards, but it looks nearly the right size for something like a Sega Genesis cartridge. At least Nintendo stuck with cartridges, which meant they could totally make the Nintendo 64 compatible with the SNES. Totally. But with handhelds, man, these things were backwards compatible all the time. You couldn't stop these things from being backwards compatible. They were backwards compatible for breakfast. The Game Boy Color could play Game Boy games, the Neo Geo Pocket Color could play Neo Geo Pocket games, all Wonder Swans played Wonder Swan games, and hey, at least with the Nintendo 64, if you plug in the transfer pack, you can play Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow through Pokemon Stadium on the Nintendo 64 and nothing else, because just keep your old Super Nintendo to play the rest of your Game Boy games on the TV. This is the mentality that I hate. Like, is there any reason why I shouldn't be able to play Game Boy games on the Nintendo 64? I have to keep my Super Nintendo if I want to play it on the TV? Well, there was an adapter to play Game Boy Advance, Color, and Game Boy games, never made publicly available, called the Wide Boy 64, developed by Intelligent Systems for the Nintendo 64. This was pretty much used to test Game Boy games, play on a TV in competitions and in demo stations. It's crazy this was never turned into a retail product, but just keep your Super Nintendo, you dumb bitch. The Game Boy Advance, of course, could play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on it, now with black borders free of charge. You can even change the aspect ratio if you're a fucking creep. Of course, the old cartridges really like to make sure you know you're playing them. These things stick out so hard, everybody on the bus will know what you're doing. Thankfully, the GameCube brought back full-blown Game Boy support with the Game Boy Player. You may not have been able to play Nintendo 64 cartridges on this thing, but you could play nearly all Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. Except the Game Boy Advance video cartridges. We were so close to a new tomorrow. They just wouldn't work. Of course, this was to stop you from recording these videos onto a VHS tape and distributing them. The market for VHSs have all grown up. Volume 1, huge. The Nintendo DS could play Game Boy Advance games. Only Game Boy Advance games. You know, to think of it, the Game Boy Micro had that limitation as well. No Game Boy or Game Boy Color support. And then to be fair, those cartridges were like 5 times the size of that thing, so made sense. The DS had 2 cartridge slots, one for DS games and one for GBA games. The inclusion of a GBA slot felt more like an escape plan though. Like, hey, if the DS doesn't do well, we can still sell it as a Game Boy Advance. When they revised the DS with the Nintendo DS Lite, the GBA slot remained, but now the games stuck out like how games stick out on a DS Lite. It was pretty bad. And then with the Nintendo DSi going forward, they removed the GBA slot. Why? Because they ran out of holes to put here. That's something you notice with the backwards compatibility. The companies just give up. The Wii, GameCube support, the whole 9 yards, 4 controller ports and 2 memory card slots. To the 80-year-olds who bought a Wii for Wii Sports, I'm sure these ports horrified them. Of course, it doesn't work with the Game Boy Player. As a kid, I was adamant these two could connect in some way, and because of that, my picture's still up at Nintendo customer support. But then with future revisions of the Wii, they stripped them of all things GameCube. Obviously to cut costs, but everybody freaked out when they did this. Even though the people freaking out already owned a Wii with GameCube support at this point. At least the Wii U always had support for Wii games, though its method of doing so was pretty clunky. You'd have to enter Wii mode to play Wii games. The system basically turned off and back on again, and bam, it's a Wii now. I mean, it works, and Wii games look really good running on a Wii U. but it is just unbelievably clunky to have to go into a completely separate mode of the system to play Wii games. Like, sure, that means most games will have full compatibility if you have the whole Wii menu set up and whatnot, but it's just weird. Like, oh man, can I access the Wii U system settings through here? No, you're in Wii mode now, fucker. The Nintendo 3DS always had support for DS games, which is a godsend. They look kinda foggy on the original model, but look pretty slick on later ones. I was surprised it didn't pull a GBA on the Nintendo DSi and remove compatibility for the DS later on. Like, why? The DS cards fit in the 3DS card slot. They would have had no reason to do it, but that's the Nintendo way.